journeys. They're just figurative journeys. Um, but they're journeys nonetheless that we're taking. And so these places can become doors to greater self-awareness. They can be gates through which we see a greater fullness of God, of ourselves, of our neighbors, and the world. So there's a Jerusalem within us, and there's an Emmaus within us, right? And both of these get enacted in our lives. So, so let's talk about some of these journeys. So I want you to consider these questions. Have you ever felt like you had to get away, like you wanted to escape? Have you ever felt like life had given you more than you could handle? Have you ever felt like you wanted to run away from life? Have you ever been deeply disappointed? Have you ever lived with unmet expectations? Have you felt lost, like your world had turned upside down? And have you ever wrestled with big questions like, who am I now? What's next? Where do I go? What do I do? Can you remember a time when you did everything right and life still did not work out the way you planned or the way you wanted? Have you ever grieved the death of a loved one, of a dream, of an identity, of a future? Has your life ever been shattered? So as you think about these questions, and I think all of us can find ourselves in these, I think you know what it's like to be Cleopas and his companion. It's Easter morning, and they're leaving Jerusalem. And who can blame them? This is a place of profound pain, of profound sorrow and loss. It's a place of death, of unmet expectations and disappointment. And it's a place where their lives were shattered. No one wants to stay in that place. When you think back to those questions I asked you of having experienced feeling lost or disappointed, or when you did things right and life didn't work out, these are places that are profoundly confusing and uncomfortable. No one wants to stay there. And as they're walking, they're talking about everything that happened. Now, I don't know because I wasn't there, but I also suspect they're talking about all the things that did not happen, all the things they hoped would happen but didn't. They're talking about Jesus' arrest, his torture, his crucifixion, his death. They're talking about hope that didn't materialize, expectations that were left unmet, and investments that paid no return. They're disappointed and they're sad. They had hoped Jesus was the one, but he's dead. And there's a part of them that's been lost too, a part of them that died with Jesus. They had heard rumors that he was alive, but it sounded like maybe just a tale, something people are saying that can't possibly be true. There was nothing to keep them in Jerusalem. Their lives have been shattered. So I don't know why they chose to go to Emmaus, but I've known times when I wanted to get away, when any place was better than the place where I was. And for them, any place would be better than Jerusalem. So they go to this place. They go to Emmaus. And Emmaus is our escape from life too, right? This is the place where we think it's going to be better. But what we don't know at the time, and what Cleopas and his companion didn't know, is that it's also the way back to life. And that realization happened for them, as it does for us, in the breaking of the bread. So it wasn't an escape from life that took them to Emmaus. It was a hunger for life. It wasn't brokenness that brought them to Emmaus, but a hunger to be whole, for wholeness. It wasn't a shattering that took them to Emmaus. It was a hunger for restoration. What they wanted most desperately was to be restored. And hunger is more than physical. It's also spiritual. It's also emotional. By nature, I think all of us are hungry. We hunger for life, for love, for wholeness, for community, for meaning, for purpose. Um, and that hunger is the reason that they urged Jesus, stay with us. But Jesus would not only stay with them, he would feed them. This guest that they invited to their table became their host. So when Jesus was with them at the table, he took bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to them. And then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. They recognized him as the one who had accompanied them on the road to Emmaus. And they recognized him as the one that they hoped he would be. So Jesus wasn't just giving them bread, he was giving them back themselves. This was their restoration. And when Jesus broke the bread, something in them also broke. Their lives were being put back together. And I think that's something that Jesus does for us as well. We've all had times when our lives were broken open in ways that we could never imagine, in ways we could never have done for ourselves. Paths we would have never chosen. And despite how that feels, and it feels terrible, as you all know, our brokenness is also not an ending. There's more to it than we can see or know. So it's not just brokenness, it's not just shattering, it's a breaking open to new life, to new seeing, to new recognition, to community, to welcome, to hospitality, to love. So in my tradition, I'm Lutheran in the ELCA church. We gather around the communion table every single Sunday. And that's why we gather. And that's our unspoken desire in all the meals we share with each other, I think. We want this new life, this new seeing, new recognition, love and hospitality and welcome. So Jesus fed them, but he didn't just feed them with bread. He fed them with himself, his body, his life, his love, his compassion, his strength, his forgiveness, his hope, with all that he is and all that he has. So their life was being restored and they're being broken open. But as soon as they saw and they recognized, he vanished from their sight. So I wonder where he went, or why he did that. It seems like a little bit of a game. Was he abandoning them? Was he playing games with them? Now you see me, now you don't. Was he undoing everything that just happened? I don't think it was anything like that. I think he was no longer with them because he was now within them. He was the burning heart within them. And it had been there all along. Sometimes that burning is felt as brokenness, sometimes as hunger, sometimes as being broken open, and other times it feels like deep joy and gratitude. But always, this is Jesus. And it says, at that same hour, they got up and they returned to Jerusalem. So they returned to the very place from which they had to get away. Jerusalem is not only the place of death, now it is the place of life. It's not only a place of sorrow, now it's a place of joy. It's not only a place of shattering, it's a place of restoration. So they arrive with news of their Emmaus experience only to hear that Jesus was alive. He was seen and he was present in Jerusalem. So we leave Jerusalem in order to return to Jerusalem, to face our deaths, our losses, our shattered lives. And in doing so, we discover that life awaits us. We return to reclaim ourselves, to recover the lost pieces of ourselves. Jerusalem hasn't changed. The city has not changed, but we have. We've changed. Shattered lives, broken bread, restored lives, Jerusalem and Emmaus, and then back to Jerusalem. That seems to be the pattern. Shattered lives, broken bread, restored lives. But it's never that simple. It's one thing to name this pattern and to see it. It's quite another to live it. It takes time and it takes effort. It's not easy and it's terribly painful. It means trusting somehow that the shards of our lives will become the pieces of new life, of new seeing, of a new way of living. So, like I said, I think this text raises a lot of questions. So you won't be surprised that I don't have easy answers for it. That I think there are more questions that I have here. I think a good question is, where do you see this pattern in your life? How have you experienced it? Are you leaving Jerusalem? Are you in Emmaus? Are you on the way? Are you returning to Jerusalem? So take a minute to think on that. And I want us to actually engage and talk about that. So take a minute to think first. And I'll put these questions in the chat so that you can see them as well. So as you think about this, you can feel free to type in the chat if you don't want to unmute, or you can unmute yourself. And you can, Catherine, can they unmute themselves or do I have to unmute them? There you go.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, for those of them that are in the Spanish, I think they would probably just have to write it on the chat.
Okay.
And then I can read it to everybody else.
Okay, great.
Karen would like to share that she feels like she's coming back to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. So she's on the way. Yeah, there's been a restoration and she's on the way back. Anybody else want to share? I was a teacher. I'm not afraid to call on you.
I would like to share something. At our church, we are delivering and giving food away to all those who are struggling, and I feel as though we are in some way not in contact with people. I feel more connected to them. I feel compassion. I see God through them. I've seen a lot of things that are happening and the way they express themselves or in their eyes. I've seen God acting between the ones who are receiving and the ones giving. I think I've noticed that God is pushing me closer. I feel like an instrument at this point. So I think I to respond to your question, I feel like I'm on my way back to Jerusalem, knowing that God is with me and that I am in that journey of just running in faith.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been quite an experience just around me and say, this wasn't me. It's all, he's, I don't know what I'm, he just puts me to the right direction. And it's just, I get,
Okay, thank you for sharing that, Jasmine.
you're welcome.
Does anyone else want to talk about where they are?
I think I am at the table. I left Jerusalem. I'm at the table, and I'm receiving. I'm getting restored, and to go back to Jerusalem. That's where I think I am.
Okay.
I've been. This time has helped me to confront myself, to see if I am walking what I believe, and to ask myself many questions about not my faith, but where I am in my faith.
Mm-hmm.
It's like like coming out and be more bold about my faith. So I think that I'm like at the table at this moment.
Okay. Being fed, receiving. Okay. Yeah. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer to any of to that question of where we are. I think there's only the answer that we have. There's the place where we are. I think it is easier for me to talk about restoration rather than being shattered or deeply disappointed or having unmet expectations. I don't mind talking about that in the past tense, but in the present, it feels very difficult to talk about those things and to be in the in-between space between shattering and restoration can be really uncomfortable. But I think whatever our answers are, they describe the intersections of our life and Jesus' life. These are all places, shattering, breaking open, restoring. They were for the disciples in this story, and they are for us too, I think. Jesus was in Jerusalem before the disciples ever left. He was with them on the road to Emmaus, and he was with them in the breaking of the bread. And then he was already in Jerusalem when they returned. So Jesus was always present at all these intersections even the ones that were most deeply painful and uncomfortable, probably especially those. So I wanted to open with that devotional because I wanted us to think about this liminal space and really what people from different backgrounds have to offer. I was I work for an organization that's Christian, and so we often have staff prayer where we pray for the work of the organization. And one day I was leading devotions, and I was leading through the story of Bartimaeus in Mark chapter 10. And this is a blind man that's on the side of the road calling out for Jesus to heal him. And as I started to speak, I became aware that the staff member sitting directly across from me in the circle was legally blind. Um, and and then I had to stop and think about how to engage that story when I have someone who has had multiple surgeries on her eyes and who is blind and who now is going to hear a story retold. I'm sure she's heard it many times about a man who's been healed of blindness when she lives in the space of knowing that it's possible because anything is possible within God's realm, but also a space where that has not happened for her, even through medical intervention. And the way that I approached that story, I asked the Holy Spirit just for wisdom in that moment of how can I engage this story, um, thinking about her specifically. And I realized that the story wasn't really about the blindness. It was really about belonging. Because in that culture, people who were blind were excluded, right? And so really what this man needed was restoration to the community. And so the healing brought him back into community. And it was really a story of belonging. Um, Not that there isn't a miracle, there is this healing miracle within the story, but that's the ultimate miracle for Bartimaeus, is not having to be alone by the side of the road, but being restored back to the community. And thinking about that from that intersection of disability, I considered all the ways that we have all these people in the scriptures that come from different cultural perspectives. And so I want to start with one that's very early on, and that's Joseph, the son of Jacob, in the Old Testament. And so I wrote a chapter on Joseph for my book. I think it's a very, it's a powerful story. That's why it's so popular. But in many ways, it has become sanitized. It has become, I think we focus so much on the outcome of that story that when I was researching and reading, I realized that it was 13 years that Joseph spent. He was sold into slavery, and he spent 13 years in this space of knowing that God was with him, but seeing his situation get worse, not better. Being an enslaved person, then being a prisoner. It's a long time to live in the space of not knowing what's going to happen to you, and also to live as a kind of bicultural person. So I want to be careful. In my book, I never ever referred to Joseph as an immigrant because he isn't. He's a victim of human trafficking, is what we would say by today's standards, right? In today's language. He doesn't willingly move to Egypt. He's sold into slavery by his brothers due to their jealousy, their envy. And then he now arrives in Egypt, and he's an extremely vulnerable person in that space. So I was thinking about that. I was thinking about my own family. We were immigrants. We moved to the United States when I was a little girl. My parents were undocumented for the first few years. We lived in the United States, and I saw some parallels between Joseph's vulnerability in Egypt and my family's own vulnerability in the United States. The fact that you don't know the language or culture. You have no way to really advocate for yourself, and you have a lot of fear about what might happen to you in this space. And of course, really bad things happened to Joseph. Pretty bad things happened to my family as well in the beginning of our lives here. But as we know, these 13 years of suffering come to an end, and Joseph is then freed, and he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man. So normally in the story, we go toward, oh, Joseph saved the whole world at that time, and you know, brought all his family to Egypt, and he was a huge blessing to this country and to his family, right? It's the story of triumph. It's the way it's normally told. Interestingly, I was reading something by Walter Brueggemann. It's a little book called Journey to the Common Good, and he was talking about this very story and about something that we often fail to notice. As you know, Joseph's family, a few generations later, becomes enslaved in Egypt. And so there's a pharaoh, right, the pharaoh dies, Joseph and his generation die, and there's new pharaohs somewhere along the line who don't remember Joseph. That's what the scripture says. They don't remember Joseph, and they don't remember what he did. And so now they just turn against the Hebrew people, the foreigners in their midst. So something interesting that Walter Brueggemann says is that this is Joseph's fault. Joseph was the one who brought his family to Egypt. That what he did is he helped Pharaoh to consolidate power, to acquire more land, and to now be in a space where he has so much power that, in fact, Joseph's own family back in the land of Canaan don't have a way to feed themselves, so they have to come to Egypt. And this is the beginning of their eventual enslavement in Egypt. And this is a perspective I never considered. So some of what I've read that other theologians have posited is that Joseph became this sort of third culture person. He was a Hebrew who grew up essentially from the time he was 17 years old. He grew up in Egypt. And then at the age of 30, he made the decision, right, to stay there. Now he was an immigrant because now he was free to come and go, but he made the decision to stay in this adopted land. But instead of thinking about the common good, he thought of what was good for the current empire that he was in. I think the story is very complicated because in one sense, yes, this is what happened. Joseph didn't know that, but we can be in this liminal space in between as a multicultural person, and we can side with the empire, or we can continue to side with our God, right? And what our God would do. We could have a lens toward liberation. So the conclusion is that Joseph had a very good life and a very good end because he, in fact, did not do that. He sided with the empire, and that benefited him greatly. He was honored and wealthy, and he was able to secure a good situation for his own family. But a few generations later, they were all enslaved. And to me, this is a very difficult reading of that story. I've always been told Joseph is a hero, and recognizing that he was this multicultural person, this third culture person. As an immigrant, I even really appreciated that perspective. But then seeing how Joseph sided with the new empire instead of thinking about perhaps other ways he could have acted in this story. So I think it's a very complicated kind of story, but it shows me the complexity of living in liminal space, of living in between, that it's very hard to live in the leap, that it's easier to live with the empire or to be on the other side, right? To be against it. But living in that leap, in that middle space, is extremely difficult, just as it's deeply uncomfortable, right? To be shattered and not know what's next, not know what will happen, or be restored and not know what's next, not know what God is opening or calling us into. But this is the space that Joseph occupied as a multicultural person. So I want you to contrast that story with another story you're really familiar with, the story of Moses or the story of Esther. So think about the story of Moses and how his story begins and how his story ends. So when you think of Joseph, my friend Daniel Camacho, he wrote a really great essay about Moses as a multicultural person. Moses, who was a Hebrew who grew up with the Pharaoh's daughter, right, and then left this space and then became the liberator of his people. So as you think about Moses, feel free to unmute yourself or to speak up. Consider, how does Moses fit into this sort of liminal space, this in-between cultural space? We have him at the beginning. It's a very terrible beginning, right? He almost dies. He could have died, but his mother saves his life. But he grows up in the palace, right? Yeah, that's exactly right. Moses speaks Spanglish. So where do you see these third culture aspects, this multicultural life of Moses? Consider the story from that perspective rather than from the traditional ways that we look at the story. So just think for a minute and then we can talk a little bit about where you see that. All right, so we have a message from Jay White who says he was adopted cross-culturally. Yeah, definitely. Other ways that you see that.
Because of his adoption, he grew up with privilege.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then at some point, he became a murderer and had to escape and go back to his people.
Mm-hmm. So there's a sense of turning his back on his privilege, right? What was the turning point for him with his privileged life?
Seeing the oppression of his people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, seeing that they were being oppressed and realizing that.
Maybe he realized his identity when he saw the oppression on his people.
Mm-hmm.
He felt that like he became disassociated from the other culture because he found himself. And that's what got him to murder,
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, how was he received by his own people at this point?
I think they were very skeptical of his motives to be there.
Mm-hmm.
Because they questioned, like, are you coming to kill us too?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it was well received.
So Laura Beth Casey says, I'm wondering about the trust issues Israel had with God were as much a part of their enculturation into Egypt, and how much is that Moses is not like them. Mm-hmm.
I'm really struggling trying to find like you know like that feeling of being like the Pachuco, like you are from here but you don't belong, and then you are not from the other land either. Like it's really like being in between where you are born in American but you are not considered American, and then you are proud of your Hispanic heritage, but you are not really considered a Hispanic pocho, you know, that identity in the in between. And I'm wondering how much of that actually made him to go deep within his heart to clinch to what he know it was true of his identity. And I think that's something that because that's why he went back. I mean, it was so much of that neediness of finding home maybe, or that hope, that I think that's when he reacted that way. And I don't know if that makes any sense to me, but I mean, I'm trying to think that in between, that it gotta be so hard to live, that it got to be in a point in your life that you have to make a definite decision to where you belong. And I think that's the part where he got.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Ernesto, for bringing that up. Because for me, the not belonging, I have felt I have never belonged, and I was born in this country. And so, and my daughters that are now a third generation continue to have somewhat of an identity crisis. And quite candidly, there's that saying, ni de aquí ni de allá. And sadly, I feel like I can't even connect with you all, if you will. I can't connect with white people. I can't connect as where the hell am I? I'm like somewhere in between. I love that expression, right? And I wonder, the problem is there just aren't enough Moseses. You know, we love the word privilege, because privilege means you got food on the table every day. Privilege means you dress well. Privilege means you get an education. Privilege means you fit. And there aren't many people that are gonna give up that seat to help their fellow man, or they can only go so far. And you know, it's a matter of the heart. It really is a matter of when we make that conscious decision about, as a Christian now, because if we're talking secular, right, that's a whole different arena. But as a person of faith, who do we really serve? Are we serving our Lord Jesus Christ, or are we still clinging on to those comfortable material places of privilege that we aspire to have? Because since we're children, we're taught to aspire, climb up the ladder, go up Maslow's, you know, ladder. And then all of a sudden now you're hit with a case of guilt.
Mm-hmm.
Guilt is just making you sick to your stomach. So let me see what route I'm going to take. And you know, that's my journey. And I can't help but tell you, as a New York Puerto Rican, that I feel closer to my Black African American brothers and sisters than I do to my Latino brothers and sisters here. It's mind-boggling to me. But if I was to really describe where do I belong, that's like comfort for me. That's
Mm-hmm.
like my rice and beans, my apple pie, my, you know, collard greens. I love gospel, you know, and so I'm really lost.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank God for our Lord Jesus Christ.
We love you, Sandy.
Love you back.
I was thinking about the thing I said about him breaking the law. So he probably never imagined that he would do anything like that. You know, you don't, most people don't think of themselves as the kind of people who could commit murder.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he responded emotionally at the time, but then he ran away and I can certainly relate to that. You want to put your past behind you. You don't want to be identified with this thing that you did. And God tells him you have to go back. And he's like, no, I don't want to go back. I'm not your guy. I can't do that. And God's like, no, you have to. And so I'm just thinking about all the times when God's like, okay, you have to deal with this. You have to face your past, but I got a job for you, whether you want to do it or not.
Mhm.
And so I can't imagine coming to this country. I have learned so much about the struggle from you all who have been honest with me and have told me your stories. And, you know, I do have this past of breaking the law and wanting it to disappear. And what happens to Moses? It gets written down in scripture and people talk about him for thousands of years. but he's still, there's some way that God works in him and redeems his big picture, right? So that's where I'm coming from.
Mhm. Saul says, I agree. Ernesto especially was reflecting about what Daniel Camacho in the essay says about his accent and how that made him to look so different. So in the essay that he's referencing, is it possible that Moses looked like a Hebrew, but he didn't speak the language well? Did he have an accent when he spoke? What was his situation like? Is it not unlike, you know, I work in an immigration clinic. I see children every day with their parents, or before the pandemic anyway, who would come in and the parents would speak to them in Spanish, the children answer in English. They're already in that in-between space. Was Moses like that too? Did that make him the ideal person for this difficult call? Laura Beth says, most spiritual awareness comes from realizing we're the kind of person who's capable of the unthinkable, for sure. Like he does that, right? In defense of his people, but it's still a pretty terrible thing to do. And, you know, interestingly to me about Moses' story is that Moses sort of lives that in between the whole time. Once they're out in the wilderness, he's still living in that. He's on the side of trusting God and believing God and having to wrangle a whole lot of people, right? That are tired, that are don't want to wander around anymore and are being made to do so. So he continues to live in that space, but his end isn't quite as wonderful as Joseph. If you remember, he doesn't get to enter the promised land. He gets to see it from afar, right? But he doesn't get to enter. He doesn't have the same kind of victorious end that we see in the life of somebody like Joseph. Joseph's life was difficult for so long, but then it got incredibly easy um, at a certain point. And we don't see that in the life of Moses. We see a continued sort of struggle, just in a different way, once he leads the people out of Egypt. And so there seems to be something, to me, contrasting these two characters. I think about the way, you know, most of my family is here in the United States. Perhaps you know a lot of immigrants too. And as I've, you know, observed people in my family, friends that I know, what I've seen are kind of two ways of being. People will either stick with a community, and, you know, to the point where I have relatives who don't speak any English, who don't wander outside the area where they live, and who interact only with other Spanish speakers, so that their world becomes very small like that, but very comfortable too, right? Very nice in that sense. And then I have seen, especially the younger people in my family, assimilate fully. So not integrate, but assimilate fully into American life to a point of almost rejection. Sometimes I would say shame about their background. And then there's that in-between space of being able to integrate, is what I call it, where you are able to access, to understand the culture and the language and navigate it, both cultures. But you sort of stand in that in-between of, okay, I can't forget about this community, but also I need to interact with this other community. And so I need to somehow bridge these spaces. I know there's Alexia Salvatierra, she talks a lot about the puentes, the bridges, the bridge people. So she thinks a lot. She works with a lot of young Latinx theologians who she believes are this bridge, the bridge people in the culture. But being a bridge is a very difficult place to be because that bridge only moves in one direction. Bridges normally move in two directions, right? You go and you come back, but being a bridge in that sense means that you're the one helping people, understand, right? You're that bridge of understanding, of clarity, of awareness, helping people to see. But you're the one that's doing that. And so for the people that have that call, it can be a very, very difficult call. And this seems to be where Moses lived, this like bridge place. He was doing a whole lot of work and not having a lot of support always, other than from God, right? God appears to him. He's one of the heroes of our faith, as we know now. So this in-betweenness, I think, is very interesting. I just finished reading a book about the myth of the American dream. And it's interesting because as I've been praying and reflecting a lot on liminality and studying it in the scriptures, it occurred to me that this person who wrote this book was saying the exact same thing, that we can't side with the American dream. We can't side with the American empire. We have to side with Jesus, which means living in this liminal space where we will be called to do really difficult things. So I wanted to say, Vanessa Ferreira says, Yo creo que Dios, believe that God chooses us and puts us in places or in certain positions, as he did with Joseph, with Esther, with Moses, to accomplish a function. And it's us who determined how we're going to respond to this call of God. So, yeah, and I agree with that. I think it's incomplete to say that Joseph just sided with the empire. I do think he served an important function in that story. But there's also a reality around that, around him helping Pharaoh to consolidate power. So I am going to share my screen momentarily because I want to share something with you that I think is very much about this whole situation. It's a poem by a writer named Martín Espada that I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but it's about it expresses that very same reality. So I'm going to share my screen, but I'm going to read it. So yeah, so this is just my document here with Tony went to the bodega, but he didn't buy anything. So let's read it together. Tony's father left the family and the Long Island City projects, leaving a mongrel, skinny Puerto Riqueño boy, 9 years old, who had to find work. Makengo the Cuban let him work at the bodega. In grocery aisles, he learned the step of the dry mambo, banging the cash register like piano percussion. In the spotlight of Machito's orchestra, polite with the abuelas, who bought on credit, practicing the grin on customers. He'd seen Makengo grin with his bad yellow teeth. Tony left the projects too, with a scholarship for law school. But he cursed the cold primavera in Boston. The cooking of his neighbors left no smell in the hallway. And no one spoke Spanish, not even the radio. So Tony walked without a map through the city, a landscape of hostile condominiums and the darkness of white faces. Sidewalk searcher lost, till he discovered the projects. Tony went to the bodega, but he didn't buy anything. He sat by the doorway, satisfied, to watch la gente, people island browned as him, crowd in and out, hablando español. Thought, this is beautiful, and grinned his bodega grin. This is a rice and beans success story. Today, Tony lives on Tremont Street, above the bodega. So what aspects do you see here of this thing we've been discussing of living in between space?
Oh my God, I'm sorry. This is so deep. But I think when you find home, you don't have to buy absolutely anything anymore. You just make your nest and rest there. And I think that's wonderful, because many of us in this in between, we're trying to get somewhere, to find something, to listen to something, but it is when we find what is home for us, what is God in this way, that's we don't have to buy anything, we don't have to take anything, we just stay there and make our home in that place. And oh, this is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
That is beautiful, Ernesto. Thank you. And you know, you took me right back to my roots. It was like, you know, I'm Puerto Rican. I married Cuban. My husband's uncle had the first Cuban American bodega in Jamaica, Queens. You know, and it really captures. I'd love to have a copy of that. Sure. if you can. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that in between, right? When you finally find home, and it is like Ernesto said, it's not about the house and the title and the, you know, is in your comfort is home with the smell of the rice and beans, el pastel, la yuca frita, you know, those comfort foods, right, that we grew up with. And in the end, like, I lost my mother in 2010, and she was just like my hero. My mother got off a plane with $50 in her pocket, running from an abusive husband who was threatening to take my brother away from her. And she knew what it was in the 50s to be homeless in New York City. And, you know, there's so many stories. And we learn to survive and navigate. And we learn to get by, but always with that longing, until we find that nest, that place that Ernesto talks about. And our challenges as Latinos, as Hispanics, they come in different stages, right? So when you're born here, you're second or third generation, your challenges now deal with corporate discrimination and with rejection in so many different levels and ways, right? Not just the undocumented that first crosses, you know, in the stories we hear. And the thing that gets to me is that a lot of white people love those those stories because it touches their heart more. It's like, ay, pobrecito, ay, bendito, oh my Lord. But they have totally forgotten inner city, just like it has happened with African American communities and Native Americans. Like, oh, like we're almost invisible because it's the border, you know, and that suffering, and it is just, man, we're all in this boat together. And I thank God that I found Christ, and I found him late in life. I'm gonna put that there. And I'm so thankful, because that's where I have found love, where I have found peace, where I have found my nest, and where I look at this world and I see all the brokenness everywhere. And I just look up, because he's my only hope. And it is from that place that I've learned to want to love people better. I'm not quite there as I should be, but I truly try to catch myself and ask God to help me love more, love better, especially when I see a lot of the injustices and a lot of, and across the table, mind you know, it's across the table. And so I'm just thankful that at 66, I have health, even in spite of this coronavirus, and that I have the opportunity to serve my community, y mi gente, right? That's how I feel. Yeah.
Thank you, Sandy, for sharing that. Yeah. I think this poem is very interesting because it very much mirrors that Emmaus story. You have the shattering, right? He has to work. His father left the family, right? He gets work in this bodega, and then he leaves. He sets off on this journey, but he returns, and when he returns, he's changed. You know, when I was a teacher, what I often saw was, you know, I taught English as a second language, and I taught just English literature. And I taught school in Florida, and literally Puerto Rican and Cuban kids would come in, and then, you know, they would enter our school knowing only Spanish, then they would learn English, and then they would go and go to college, maybe Boston, maybe not. But the goal was never to return. The goal was never to return. You're supposed to go, right? Especially as a bicultural person, as an immigrant person, you're reminded by your parents often of how many sacrifices they're making for you to do well in school, for you to have a better life. And yet what you see in this story is that Tony returns. He goes to the law school in Boston, but today he lives above the bodega. He's kind of chosen to live in this liminal space. You know, he could leave, right, and be in a more comfortable place in terms of he has an education, right, and he we can assume can probably blend into the culture very, very well, but instead he comes back. And when I read this, I thought a lot about Moses. I thought about returning to this difficult thing, but also the place where you belong, a place where you have belonging. These are your people. I wonder now what someone like Tony can do, because he understands both cultures so well. How can he advocate now in this community with who he is? And I think about Moses being this perfect person because he knows how Egypt works. That's where he grew up. He knows that culture, but also he knows that he doesn't come from them. He has an awareness that there are Hebrew people being oppressed and that he belongs to them. And he becomes this catalyst, right? This person that God calls. And in many ways, that being a third culture or liminal person helped him to prepare for that role. So I found that really interesting, and I wondered about the possibilities in Joseph's story. I wondered if Joseph could have helped all of the lands and not just Pharaoh to consolidate power and land and everything that he did. I wondered if that was possible in his story as well. So I'm going to stop share here and go back to the. So Karen Rivera says, in the search, in the constant search that we have as human beings, we have to find the place where we belong. We have this longing to find that peace that we seek. So, as I've been reflecting on this, because I'm thinking of writing this book on liminality, on the gifts that immigrants bring to the church. This sense of, it's difficult to live in that space of ni de aquí ni de allá, right? We call it neither from here nor from there, living in this in between. I have a good friend in California who's Chinese American, and her family has been here for generations. And she says, it's interesting, as an Asian American person, I know that I'm never fully going to belong because I'm always going to be treated as a perfectual foreigner because of the way that I look. People automatically assume that I must be from somewhere else, even though my family's been here, for several generations, right? There's that longing that she has. To just belong, to not be questioned, to not be asked where she's from again, but to just belong. So this is a longing that all human beings have. And I think that often, right, as I worked with students, and now as I am, my family's all immigrants, and I work with a lot of immigrants in the organization, and I see that difficult space. And often we focus on how much sort of the disadvantages, the hardships, right, of being in that space. But I want to consider the other side, which is what are the gifts of being in that space. So last year, I don't know if you remember, but Ilan Omar, who is a Somali, a former Somali refugee, and who is now a representative in Congress for her district in Minnesota, she sent out a tweet on social media that I thought was really interesting. I actually saved it because I took a picture of it and saved it, because she said, 24 years ago, we arrived in the United States as refugees, and we came to DC. And now I'm returning to DC, but now I'm returning as a representative of the people of my district in Minnesota. So to me, it reflected a really beautiful mutuality in immigration that often isn't talked about. We often talk about welcome and hospitality. These are very common themes when talking about immigration. Welcome the stranger, love the stranger as yourself, right? But what if the stranger brings gifts? They bring faith, they bring skills, talents, their creativity, they bring their work, and they bring their families. And all of these things now are given to this new country, right? New context. And this is something that's never talked about, that there's both receiving, their immigrants receive, but they also give a lot, and they give more than their work. Because the other pitfall is to think of immigrants only as laborers, as people who work. And that's something I see a lot as well. Not that it isn't true, but we're people, right? And so we bring our whole selves. But often we don't think about that. So what are the gifts of this space, of this liminal space of being in between? What do people in between have to teach the church? What gifts do they bring to the church? And how can the church position itself to better listen and receive these gifts, right? I think in the story of Ilan Omar, who now is giving back, there isn't, because there was such a gap, there was like a 24-year gap, right, from the time that she arrived and received welcome as a refugee in the United States to the time that she now is serving the country in Congress, is a U.S. citizen. But I wondered what it would be like if we listened in that space to what. So what did Moses have to give? What did Joseph have to give that put them in this position to be able to serve? I mean, in amazing ways, both of them, right? So I want us to reflect on that for a time. Like, what does liminality offer us? What does being on the road to Emmaus offer us? What does it bring? We know the disadvantages, we know the hardships, but what are some of the gifts of that space?
Karen, I really love the image that you use about the leap.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if, I mean, this leap is something dynamic where you keep jumping, where because we are in this country, we keep, we need, I mean, in order to survive, we need to interact, right, with the empire. But I guess what is key is that we don't stay there. We keep, I mean, we jump, and sometimes we need to be in that space in between. But sometimes we need to go back to our roots and in a way recharge there. And I wonder with the poem that Tony's poem, how some people stop jumping and stay in empire, and or stay in the tension, but they are all the time shattered, right? With the word that you also use, shatter and stretch, and they cannot have joy, right? They cannot enjoy that space, or cannot remember that it's okay to sometimes go back and rest and jump again, or be in that tension. So yeah, I guess I'm just reflecting aloud, but yeah, you cannot hear me?
Your voice is very low. I can hear you, but yeah.
Oh. What about now?
Better.
Okay, well, yeah, and I'm just wondering, can you say something about those who keep, I mean, who stay in one side of the image that you gave us? And I'm thinking specifically right now about, that is, my understanding is that it is two Latinos who are suing California because of the help that they want to offer to undocumented immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just thinking, I mean, I want to understand them, right? I mean, what is in their journey that lead them to that point in their lives where they cannot see the oppression, or if they see it, they become part of the oppression too. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good question, because I'm sure this is something that all of us have seen. I was thinking about this specifically because I was raised in Florida with Marco Rubio, who is a representative who has really not advanced the cause, even though he's a child of immigrants. Same thing with Ted Cruz in Texas, a son of a Cuban immigrant, but has sided with, sort of the conservative side of American politics and against the interests of immigrants or compassionate policies for immigrants. And I think that's the danger of siding with the empire. There's living in the leap, right? We live in between and we see our community and we love them and care for them, but we also know how to navigate the empire. Much like Naomi was poor and too old to work, but understood the culture and could tell Ruth, hey, this is what you need to do to position yourself in this culture in order to benefit from it, right? She understood that space, even as a person without a lot of power. And this is what we need. We need Naomi's in the world. We need people who will be in that space of, it's hard to live in liminal space. It's much easier to be with the empire, right? Or I was listening recently to a National Public Radio interview. It was a story about a border guard who found out that he himself, his papers were falsified and he was in fact undocumented. And he reflected back on all the harm he had done to Mexican people like himself along the borderlands defending the empire. And he didn't seem to see, he couldn't see his way toward being a Moses figure. He could only understand as sort of being a Joseph, being on the side of the empire and defending it and trying everything he could do to protect it. And now he's in this precarious situation where the empire will not help him, will not come to his aid. But he still didn't understand, and he still thought, well, I did everything right. So I think this is what's beautiful about Tony goes to the bodega and doesn't buy anything, right? Tony lives in that space. And I think there's a sense in which also we, the church, we're supposed to live in liminal space. We're supposed to be here, but not be so attached, right? Not to have all these attachments to all the things that are here. We're supposed to live in that in-between space too. But it's a very difficult space to be in, as we see in the life of Moses. It's a difficult, difficult place. As we see in the life of Esther, frankly. In the life of Esther, we see this too. And we see a point at which her guardian, Mordecai, tells her she has to make a decision about what she's going to do. Is she going to stay in this comfortable place where she's accepted and she's got privileged? Or is she going to take that position and use it to advocate for her people who are in peril, who are literally going to lose their lives if she's not able to intervene in this space, right? But Mordecai actually is very hopeful. He says, God will raise up somebody else, but you have this opportunity, right? You have this time. So she has a sort of angel on her shoulder to bring her into this decision that's critical for her people. But what I find troubling as I see in the church, right? We have this, since the election of Donald Trump, we've seen a lot of the ways in which the church has sided with the empire rather than being in this liminal space and using any power and privilege to care for people who are in vulnerable situations. So we see that in our culture at large. I work in an organization where we serve immigrants, and yet I see that immigrants aren't asked to be on our board, aren't asked to be senior leaders, aren't asked to be in positions where they're also not just served and cared for, but they're also people who are now making decisions to care for others. So they can receive, but they somehow can't lead in the organization. So there's all these places where we have the opportunity to live in liminal space, but because it's so deeply ambiguous, uncertain, and uncomfortable, it's difficult to live there. It's difficult to stay there, right? It's almost easy to become comfortable and to slide more and more toward the empire, where we can wake up one day and be a Latino who is speaking out against immigration, who is speaking out against welcoming policies or providing healthcare or stimulus provisions for people who are undocumented. I think we're in this moment where it's not even mutuality, but what we're seeing is that immigrants are actually doing for us. They're the farm workers in the fields. 40% of physicians are foreign, 50% of medical scientists are foreign, 25% of nursing assistants that work in nursing homes with our elderly. So it's not even a mutuality now. We are actually receiving more from the immigrant community at this moment than we're giving to them. Like they're literally putting their lives at risk during this pandemic time. And there's just still seems to be a lack of recognition, you know, about what immigrants are bringing and what immigrants have given and what they have to teach the church from their unique position, right? This unique place where God has placed them.
If I may, Karen, so also from Miami, and I know Michael Rubio well and the Cuban culture very well, right? And I think that you would have to know the Cuban background and with Fidel and that whole scenario to understand that culture. But for example, my in-laws came before Castro to New York, okay? And so there are differences. And then when the Marielitos came, there came another wave of Cubans with a different set of thinking. So I don't think it's quite, you know, like put a label and all, but here is something that, and let me explain that I have never been a Republican, but I don't think the church, okay, is doing a good job in being the church, because it's either siding with one or the other. When you talk about the empire, I feel like, man, the empire is on both sides. You know, if you want to, you're saying empire, but you're really talking Republicans. And quite honestly, the Democrats have been a disappointment to me, my life, that I've been here in 66 years. And I have often said, and people have heard me talk about, that I'm not satisfied with, and I don't want a block of cheese, and I don't want charity, right? Because when the civil rights movement came, it didn't come for us to live on our knees or saying yes sir, no sir, thank you. It came for equality. And if you were able to, you know, and that brought a whole bunch of challenges. And those are the challenges that we still have today, right? Of discrimination, of we've come a long way, but we haven't come nowhere near as what we should. And so many of our own representatives, right, that have sold out or have let us down. So my faith in God and my return to Christ and the church is because I don't want politics in it. I don't want to hear about the empire, because I know what the empire is. It's evil. That's what it is. It's plain evil. So how do we stop pointing fingers and talking about the evil one, which is what I've heard all my life, and how do we shine a light? We are the people. I do believe the people have the power. The Statue of Liberty welcomes all immigrants. This country was built with immigrants. And, I just feel that we just don't recognize our own resilience. That's a good word that we use today, resilience.
Mm-hmm.
We're more than resilient. African American people have been more than resilient, Native American. And we continue to fall in this trap of us and them. And I really wish the church would do a better job than picking a side.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard. I'm not saying that there aren't abuses and misuses of power that should be voiced, but give Caesar what's Caesar and God was God.
Mm-hmm.
And I really try very much to live on that line.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sandy. And I wasn't specifically, maybe I was picking on Marco Rubio just because I grew up in Florida, but I was talking about just the kind of immigrant person who ends up aligning with the new country and sort of forgetting the old country and forgetting to advocate for their own. And their own doesn't have to be necessarily, people in my case who are Guatemalan, but all immigrants. I have a kinship with all immigrants as we share this similar experience, right? Yeah, and I think that often we focus so much on what we have to give to immigrants and what we can do for them. People have asked me a lot, well, what can I do right now, for immigrants? And I think it's a good question. I don't think that's a bad question at all. And I think we should think about that, because if we have things like citizenship and other privileges, there are things that we can do to help our community. But also there's so much to learn from our communities. So I attend in Baltimore a church that is in the inner city of Baltimore. And as you know, Baltimore is a city that has had a lot of struggles historically. And so my church is African American. And one day I gave a sermon on Mary, the mother of Jesus. I grew up in the Catholic Church as a young woman. And so I have a kinship with Mary, the mother of Jesus. And I just talked about the things you talk about when you talk about Mary and a sermon that's given in the Advent season. But afterwards, an African American woman came up to me and she said, she's someone who's not a seminary graduate like me. But she said, I want you to know that the sermon meant a lot to me. I didn't realize how much Mary and I had in common. My son was also killed by the state. And her son was killed at the hands of the Baltimore Police Department. And she recognized that Mary knew and understood her pain. And she saw herself in the mother of Jesus. And so, often in my church, I am surprised, and I shouldn't be, by how much I have to learn from the people in my community. And it's very similar when I've had to work with immigrants who are not in a position that I'm in, who are struggling to learn English, who maybe don't have very much education, and who left, terrible situations behind. And I will learn so much at their feet, not just an insight here and there, but I've recognized that I have the most to learn from people living in vulnerable situations, but also on the margins and on this in this space, right? Not of privilege, but certain privileges, and yeah, this sort of middle space. And so that's where I feel like I would like us as a church to be more cognizant of not just what we can do for immigrants and for the immigrant community, but what they have to teach us. And it's, I have a good friend who wrote a book called Love Undocumented. She married an undocumented immigrant. And she has shared that as she talks about immigration, and she's white, and she says people will say, "Oh yeah, being around immigrants, I'm just so grateful for everything I have, for all the stuff I have, and they're poor." And she's like, "Well, that's not what immigrants have to teach you. It's not just that. It's not just that you should be grateful for your stuff, but there's so much, as you said, Sandy, resilience in the community." There's a Vietnamese man who does a TED Talk, and I'm going to send Catherine and Ismail the name so that you have it. But one of the things he talks about is that he and his family left as Saigon fell, and he was a baby in his mother's arms as they're leaving Saigon. And they were supposed to get on a bus, and the bus, the baby he was a baby and he started screaming, and so the parents decided not to get on this bus. Well, the bus ended up being hit by artillery, and everyone in the bus died. And he and his family got on the next bus and were able to make it to a boat and eventually to the United States. And he says that as a teenager, he would ask his parents, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd gotten on the first bus?" And his parents said, "No." Because it turns out that in Vietnamese, there's no conditional for thinking about, if this had happened, then this other result would have taken place. There's no way to express that. And actually, that fact alone made his parents extremely resilient, because instead of fearing and thinking about what might have happened, they just kept going forward and moving forward and making decisions. And so he says he would ask his parents all the time, "What if this and what if that?" And they're like, "Why do you think about that? Just keep going. Just keep moving forward." And this is a gift, this kind of resilience of not being, paralyzed by the bad things that happen to us, but continuing to move forward. There's an incredible amount of strength in the community that can be taught, I think, to the larger culture, if we have the humility, right, to sit at their feet and learn. And so I think this is part of what we see in this liminal space. What do we learn from the story of Moses or the story of Esther? What do we learn about their courage? Oh, sure, Catherine.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
yeah, sorry. I just want to make sure, since I know we have like 5 minutes left, to make sure to give some, I know it's just a little time, but like if there's any final questions for you or any comments that people would like to make at this time, to kind of just open the call for some of that. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm sorry. I've gone over because we started a little bit later. I apologize. But yes, if you have questions or comments, we can talk about that as well.
Yeah, and also really quickly, just wanting to let know all of you, part of like what we are doing now with these webinars, right? Instead of having the Sumergete retreat that we had to cancel because of things with COVID-19 and everything, we're doing a series of webinars each month. So you'll hear about another one we'll be making in May and in June, in July. So yeah, just keep your eyes open. We'll be contacting you about that as well.
Karen, can I? Hi.
Sure.
I was just thinking about, what you said about Joseph, it's the first time that I hear that perspective and how he sided with empire, and thinking about so many immigrants who come to this country and have a stable life after maybe struggling a lot, and then help their families and their friends come here.
Mm-hmm.
They are struggling in their countries, and so help them come here and have a better life. Though they might have a better financial life, but then they come here to live under oppression and afraid of being detained by ICE and all we know. So I'm just wondering and trying to understand, what would be the comparison between Joseph and immigrants? Are there similarities? Is different? you know, immigrants who are always, yeah, and I had I mean, many people who is always thinking about having a better job, saving money to be able to bring here their family members or their friends.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question, because when I read the story of Joseph, you know, he is released from prison and all of a sudden he has the highest position in the land next to Pharaoh. He becomes that powerful. He's the ultimate immigrant success story. If you think about it in that sense of, he has this level of success, and like you said, he brings over his family, right? Or rather, they come seeking, they're hungry, they come seeking sustenance, right, in Egypt. And I don't think the analogy is perfect with immigrants, but I think that there is a sort of level of, you know, he marries an Egyptian wife, right, and his children have Egyptian names. And so in that sense, he seems to have really adapted to Egypt. I mean, having been there since he's 17 years old and now he's 30 years old, he comes out of prison and he seems to know and understand that culture well. And he seems to know how to navigate it. I wonder if he lost his accent. I wonder if, you know, he spoke, he was like one of them, you know, he was, and there were certain advantages he had as a foreigner. He was handsome. We learned that in the beginning of that story. And so what are some of the advantages that he had? And I don't know, but perhaps this is Joseph's destiny with God, or perhaps he could have labored with God toward a different end. I don't know the answer to that question, but that's what I wondered about. Like, could Joseph have lived in that space and now reached this level of success, brought his family over, and now how can we make it so that we take care of everyone in a vulnerable situation, not just so that Pharaoh can have the most power and the most land, but so that maybe everyone should know about the dreams and about what they mean, not just Egypt. Maybe this is knowledge that would serve the whole community, you know, outside of Egypt as well. So I think it's a complicated question. I don't think there's certainly right or wrong answers, but I do think there's something in those stories of all these people like Daniel, like Esther, like Moses, who lived in these liminal spaces, and the decisions that they had to make in these spaces, and what did they do. So yeah, I don't want us to go over time, but I want to give you a chance to ask questions and I'll send you some documents so that you have some of these things.
I want to share something with you that has stuck with me since I heard it. And it was from my pastor, Matt Evans. And it was about, talk about this, the enslavement of the Jews, right? 400 years of being slaves. And I want to thank you for Tony's story and for keeping the stories alive, because in the sermon that I heard, what Pastor Matt said was, right, that there was 400 years of generation after generation telling the story of their God. 400 years. And that kept their God alive to the next generation and the next generation. And I love that sermon. And I'm not giving it any justice, but that message was so powerful. And that's what we have. When you ask the question, what do immigrants give to the community? What do we have to give? Man, we have life to give. We are a people that are full of hope, that are full of strength, that have, for most, are believers, that are trust. And a lot of the Americans and that see that is like, wow, they marvel at it because they've lost some of that, taking it for granted. And here we come and they're like, oh my God, these people don't have nothing. And look how happy they are. Oh my God, they're working in the fields and look, they're smiling, you know. It's that light, that life, that shine.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So that's what I think we have to
Yeah.
get.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you all. I'm sorry we don't have more time for everybody to ask questions, but let us finish. Just want to thank you all for being here. We'll send you more information about our other webinars. Probably by the end of this month or something like that. So let us pray. Let's finish this time with prayer. If you enter this prayer with me. Our God, we give you thanks for the time that you've allowed us to be here through this technology. We give you thanks for Karen and for the gifts that you've bestowed upon her, for the ways that she's spoken a word that comes from you. Thank you, Holy Spirit, for your presence in this place. Thank you that you've reminded us that in our wounds, you're present, in our shattering, there's life. That you're here, God, whether we're walking to Emmaus or walking to Jerusalem. That you're here while we stand in the in-betweenness, that you're opening an invitation for us to see you more clearly in that, whether that's in ourselves or in our immigrant neighbors that surround us, in our local places, homes, churches. We give you thanks for this time, and we ask that as we turn off these computers and return to our places and our homes, may you remind us of these truths now and forevermore. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Muy, la verdad, muy, muy bueno. Qué bueno. Te escuché.
Hola, hermana Vanessa, gusto
Ay.
verla.
Igualmente, ¿cómo están? Qué
Muy bien.
buenos.
Bendiciones, chicos.
Bendiciones. Me quería anotarme el nombre del libro. Lo puso acá. Ah, no está.
Oh, si ya quieres quitar el recording.
Ay, sí.